Hello and welcome to week 7 in developmental psych. And I'm going to change things up a little bit. I've been taking these time to review the course book content, looking directly into the course book. But since you already have that, and in preparation for face-to-face classes next semester, decided I'm going to start preparing some slideshows and actually basically go through the slideshow as if I was in a face-to-face class with you. So that's what we'll be doing. So we're going to cover Chapter 6 this time, and the Chapter 6 is on adolescence. And we start off adolescence with the doom and gloom or storm and stress point of view of adolescence. This is a long-standing point of view that actually dates back, interestingly, to the ancient world and the perception of adolescence this time. Although adolescence itself as a specific period of time is more of a recent invention. In the modern times, however, in the world of psychology, the idea of storm and stress actually came from G. Stanley Hall, who was a psychologist. He was the first president of the American Psychological Association. And this is quite a ways back, and that pretty much set the stage for the notion of this being a stormy, stressful, conflict-ridden era of people's lives. And really that kind of grew into the movement of creating middle school, to tell you the truth, that junior high school was specifically oriented toward this particular age span. The fact is, however, that modern researchers such as Arnett, in 1999, as modern as that can be, 21 years old, 22 years old, the notion that adolescence is by definition stormy and stressful is somewhat supported because there's some stuff going on during this time. Particularly what we might see are the adolescent's exploration of identity that then runs counter to the family of origins value system and whatnot. And so that can create some stress there. But in truth, not everybody experiences this. In fact, when you do research, you find, that very many, if not most, teens transition through this period of time relatively unscathed. Culture plays a huge role in terms of the expectations and the social clock of what is supposed to be going on at this time as kids are developing the cognitive abilities of adults, but don't necessarily have all of the responsibilities yet. So that plays a role. There is an increased conflict with parents, like I said. There is some mood disruptions and a higher increase of risky behavior. But this notion that this is an all-encompassing sort of period of time where they're all going through stress and hormones are all going all over the place, that really, really doesn't pan out very well in the research. So I decided let's talk a little bit about puberty itself. And I chose this image. This is from the new movie, not the second one, but the first one when all the kids... Here's bunch of adolescents. I thought that'd make a really good picture as the background here. And let's take a look at stuff like growth spurts occur during this time, the physiological development, and the development of secondary sex characteristics such as pubic hair, breasts, and muscular shapes and whatnot. And it's really, what's a really interesting aspect of this particular stage of development, this physical maturation, where the children are developing into sexual beings, that physiologically has a lot to do with the timing. So when it happens, and this is kind of a blend of the psychological clock, biological clock, and social clock. And what we recognize is that there are some teens that we consider, just say there's normal, people that develop at the normal timing and then everything sort of works out for them. But then we have early and late development. You see the early development of these secondary sex characteristics and late development of these secondary sex characteristics. And in the Western world, whether you're a boy or a girl makes a significant difference in terms of the predicted outcomes, the trends that sort of happen from early and late development. So if we look at these individually, you will see that early developing boys are actually in a good place. If they develop early, they have more competitive ability, they're stronger, taller, larger, they become a focus of people's attention, they can become leaders. And in fact, there's actually some great research on height and early development and its relationship to politics and leadership in the military and stuff like that. It really creates an avenue for that for boys, whereas that early development doesn't have the negative consequences that it might have for girls, which we'll get to in a little bit. But early developing boys tend to be, they're rewarded for that. They're stronger, bigger. My eldest brother, Alan, was an early developing boy. When he was in junior high, he was recruited into all of the high school athletic teams, and he was captains of the teams. All of that came very early, and that has shaped his development, certainly. He continues to be a leader in his community, continues to be a great businessman, and lots of benefits that he got from that. On the other hand, late developing boys may be subject to ridicule. They may be subject to being pushed out. They're the last person picked on the team, those kinds of things. And there's some degree of issues with self-esteem, but as we're going to see, they're not as intense as when these differences exist among girls. The late developing boys may develop more introverted personalities. They may not get picked on the team. They may find other ways that they can still be competitive, and even though they're lagging behind their peers in terms of the development of their bodies. And by and large, there's, of course, some degree of damage that's done by this, but not significantly. The group that is most profoundly impacted by this is early developing girls. Now, statistics will tell us that an early developing girl is more likely to drop out, get pregnant, use drugs, become delinquent. It goes on, and we ask ourselves what it is. What is it about early developing girls that we tend to see these things appear more often? And it might be that even though they're emotionally, or the psychological clock is that they're still children, they're then seen by other people in their world as being older than they are. They're being seen as objects of desire, sexualized individuals. And that attraction to an older crowd, let's say, can lead them astray. It also, at the same time, when you're looking at, let's say, a group of girls, the early developing girls can sometimes be ostracized by their peers. So not only do they gain the attention, probably the unwanted attention of older boys, they also often lose the social support of their same age mate girls. And so they're left alone and vulnerable. And for those kinds of reasons, we see possibly these trends that happen with early developing girls. Finally, there's late developing girls. Now, late developing girls, similar to late developing boys, we're not seeing that there's really too much of a deal about this. There might be some ostracization from groups as the whole group starts to develop, but by and large, they kind of make their way through this period of time relatively unscathed. So we're really looking at two categories here. We have early developing boys being advantaged by that, and we see early developing girls being profoundly disadvantaged. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about big numbers, we're talking about trends, we're talking about those kinds of things. You can't diagnose this way, but let's say you have an early developing girl in your family. It's going to be important to address some of these things that they may encounter in the world that they might find challenging. So that said, we head on into some aspects of our brain and cognitive development. And what I did is I picked here, what you're seeing on your screen is an image from the Sistine Chapel painted by Michelangelo. And what it portrays is God on the right-hand side is communicating, communicating with Adam and the story of creation being developed here. Now, interestingly enough, one of the strange imageries that has been recognized in this particular painting is that the God figure is in a sort of shell of some kind, surrounded by all kinds of angels and cherubims and stuff like that. And the shape of that shell and the if you look at the musculature of the cherubim and all that, it kind of looks like a brain. So if we superimposed a brain image on top of that, you can see that brain, sort of that shape right there. And what that seems to mean is that this is possibly Michelangelo, who was very aware of human anatomy, was actually painting this brain, and that the emerging ability, let's in the idea of Christianity, the fall of humanity was when human beings gained the knowledge of good and evil by eating from the forbidden tree. One of the two forbidden trees, actually. And so this notion of understanding right and wrong and therefore being responsible for right and wrong is sort of the cognitive thing that's happening in adolescence. So this may very well be the process of adolescents becoming adults. And the reason I say that, and this is a speculation, of course, but if you look at the positioning of God's hand coming out of the brain, let's say, to reach Adam, who's in adolescence, and notice that their fingers are not touching. And what this can represent is that Adam and his very selfish needs as a child is slowly reaching toward a connection with, let's say, the godly presence in the human brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to integrate the values and norms of our society and use them to mitigate our behavior. Basically, to sin, to not sin, to avoid sin, in staying within the religious context here. So we see that space happens. Now, the egocentric needs of Adam represented outside here. Certainly he's outside and it's the world that's tempting and all of those things. He represents the human limbic system, the pleasure-seeking sort of aspect of the brain, and God's hand reaching right through the frontal portion of the brain, prefrontal cortex, and we recognize biologically the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex are the parts of the brain that need to connect. They're not quite there yet, but they need to connect in order for an individual to be able to subjugate their will or their just free-willing desire that are selfishly oriented, and in order to take proactive, pro-social behavior that's a management system in the brain, in the prefrontal cortex. So there's some that perceive this painting as a portrayal of the neurological development that happens through adolescence, where the limbic system portrayed by Adam, with the temptations of the world and self-servingness of it, are reaching out to connect with the more noble or controlling aspects of the adult human mind represented by the prefrontal cortex. Who knows? Who knows? Okay, so we're moving along here, still talking about cognitive development, and maybe I've triggered some of you. Maybe some of you don't like algebra, and I put all these algebraic things here. And what I wanted to talk about as we enter into the discussion about Piaget's continued presence in our lives here going into adolescence. In fact, this is where we're going to leave we're going to leave Piaget behind during this time. I want to talk to you about formal operational thinking and algebra. Now, up until now, we've been talking about the different kinds of the qualitative differences in thinking according to Piaget's theory. So we started with sensory motor, the integration of sensory and motor movement. We saw the 3 subcategories of that, and then we moved into pre-operational thinking. So the schemas were not really developed, therefore the notion of being able to manipulate them, to operate upon those ideas and schemas was not fully developed. Then we went into concrete operations. So yes, we could manipulate ideas in our brain, but they were more based on our concrete, evidence-based experiences that we have. And then now we're into formal operational thinking, where the ideas and concepts that we're dealing with do not need to be real. They can be imaginary. They can be symbolic. They can be abstract. And the skill sets that develop from here are really usher in very, very important aspects of our cognition. Now, algebraic thinking is by fundamental definition abstract. So when we think of, look at some of the equations you can still see, we see the letter A as a symbol that represents a variable. And we leave it at that. We don't need to define A, we just need to solve for it, right? Given all this other information, often the question is, solve for A. What's the A mean? And it's an exercise in the kind of abstract reasoning that allows individuals later on, or develops over time, the ability to problem solve when you're looking at a situation and everything seems to be okay, but something's not going right. So you're basically solving for the unknown. You're solving for the missing variable, right? And it's the same cognitive skill. So algebra, as a mathematic endeavor, is actually a very, very apt training program for individuals to develop very acute formal operational thinking. At the same time, so is music. Music is very mathematical in terms of just different experience of it, but the study of music does the same thing, understanding the relationships, the new mathematical relationships, although we don't express them that way, but tones on a guitar, the notes on a guitar and their relationship with each other are defined mathematically, and we understand harmony and chord structures and scales and whatnot by understanding that structure within there again, which is extremely abstract. It's really hard to use words to describe a sound, just like it's hard to use words to describe a taste. These are very abstract concepts. Now, what we get from formal operational thinking is abstract thinking. We can think about things abstractly, things that are unreal. We get problem-solving skills. We solve for unknowns. And we can now engage in the process of deduction. Now, deduction is the famous form of investigative inquiry that we see with Sherlock Holmes. And he's famous for saying that in a closed room in which a crime has occurred and everybody that was there is still there, I don't need to know who did it. I just need to prove who didn't do it. And whoever's left has to be the guilty person. So it's deducting that ability to solve a problem by saying, not there, not there, not there, not there, it must be here. Consider this in terms of hide and seek, the way we might approach hide and seek from a concrete operational thinking versus a formal operational thinking, and we'll immediately guess why kids in formal operational thinking always win at hide and seek. So the concrete operational thinker, wondering where their friend is hiding, will look around and basically consider, where would I hide? Where are good hiding places? Okay, and they would go to those places and sequentially go to the places that they can think of in order to find them, because that's concretely how they would find their own hiding place. A formal operational thinker, however, using deduction, knowing and implying their knowledge of the individual they're trying to find, they can deduce, where would this person not go? So let's say we know Billy doesn't like spiders, so he's not going to be under the barn. He also doesn't like cars for some reason. He's not going to be in the garage. So we would not even start to look there, even though those might be places we would pick to hide. And we see that different perspective in being able to think deductively versus concretely. What it produces is an adolescent logic. Now logic is the process of deduction. If this, then this, and understanding relationships within the world. They can be abstract. They can be all of those things that like be nice to others and they'll be nice to you. Those kinds of tenets of our philosophy that we have all rest in adolescent logic because they're simplistic. If I have a lot, I can give to you. Why don't rich people give to the poor people? These kinds of relatively simplistic perspectives, but they're logical. They make sense. If we have tons and tons of food sitting in silos rotting in America, why are there hungry people around the world? What is logically that makes no sense. However, what we do know is that the logic of adolescence is flawed. It's flawed in a number of ways. Now, it's flawed in ways that we're not going to get into until we talk about adult cognitive development, and we make that clear distinction between adolescent logical formal operational thinking and adult formal operational thinking, such as the case of food being rotting in shelves while other places go hungry. There's an issue of transportation. There's an issue of getting that food from one place to another. There's the infrastructure that may or may not be there. And I'll go into some analysis of that as to when the adult logic is still logical, but it's not straightforward. And it takes into account aspects of the situation such as logistics, emotions, diversity, and whatnot that tend to get in the way of pure logic. But back to our adolescent thinkers here, it is flawed because of adolescent egocentrism, which is the flawed logic of adolescence, because adolescents continue to retain some of the egocentric qualities they had as children, and now, even though we expect them to be, acting like adults, there are still some ways in which they approach the world that get in the way of that. And the first one here is called imaginary audience. Now, the problem with imaginary audience is, for some reason, be what it may, adolescents, because they are in the process, as we'll see with Erickson, developing their sense of identity, they're moving away from their family as the only source of information as to who and what they are and what they will become, and other people in their environment are becoming important. They have the abstract ability to understand that their impression on other people will impact how that person feels about them. Now, this, however, can become obsessive, and the individual can become primarily focused on what we would view as an imaginary audience, meaning that at all times they feel like they're on stage, they walk into a room, and every casual look at them, they perceive it's at them. They might be looking at the clock behind you, they might be looking at the person behind you, whatever. But the feeling is they're looking at me. I feel like I'm on stage. I feel like I'm always being judged. I'm feeling all that. And that's a flaw in thinking. There's some reality to that. We understand that, but certainly not to the extent that some might garner their understanding of the world. Now, the next feature of adolescent egocentrism that we see is personal fable, one of my favorite ones to talk about. Now, personal fable, think about it. Fable is a story, but it's not a real story. It's a story, okay? Or it doesn't have to be a real story. Now, the fable that adolescents carry around with them is the situations that they're going through are profoundly unique, and therefore there's an extremely small number of people that would actually understand them. And that small number of people certainly doesn't include their parents. So individuals can be going through a hard time at school, or they're dealing with getting picked on or whatever, and they no one understands, because I'm experiencing this uniquely, and what they're experiencing is the firsthand experience. The firsthand experience of these kinds of things is unique to them. And we can never really fully that's the logic of it. You can never fully understand what somebody's going through, but that doesn't mean that others don't understand what they felt like personally when they went through that, and that they can still provide advice and comfort around that. And finally, we see the illusion of invulnerability. And this is where we get that higher degree of risk-taking. This notion that even when things have happened close, although that certainly has turned some people around, even when things have happened close, sometimes individuals feel they just simply won't happen to them. I'm in control of this car. I'm in control of the substances I'm using. I'm in control of walking on this bridge, whatever those things. But there could be a sense of aggrandized invulnerability. It won't happen to me. We, of course, know that that's not true. And certainly this can lead to some pretty dangerous behaviors. Now, quickly transitioning here, there's our cognitive development, including Piaget and these concepts coming from David Elkins, the one that put forth that idea of adolescent egocentrism. Now we're going to take a look at Erikson, the psychosocial development that's happening during adolescence. And here we have our graphic that portrays all of Erikson's stages, and we see the stage we're at right now is adolescence, identity versus role confusion. Now, it's important to recognize that the first 4 stages lead us to this. When we think about the first stage of trust versus mistrust, do I belong in the world? Am I loved? Are people going to take care of me? Things are going to generally go in the right direction. And then we have autonomy versus shame and doubt. Can I do things on my own? And then initiative. Can I initiate activities? Am I creative? Can I influence the world in ways, that are to my own needs? And finally, industry, where we have this entry into the school system. How do I compare to everybody else? So we have trust, autonomy, initiative, and industry, leading to let's view this as the bricks that make up the foundation of the first sense of self. Not the first sense of self, but the first kind of solidified sense or all-encompassing sense of self that starts to develop in adolescence. Now, Erikson never said, and would never say, that identity happens during this time. Identity is happening all the time. What this is looking at, in line with what we just saw about the cognitive egocentrism that can happen, that adolescent egocentrism, this is a period of time of focusing on the self. Lots of reasons for this. It's expected during adolescence that we're supposed to seriously start consider, let's say, career options in front of us. Because we're going to get into high school and we're going to select classes based on that, I guess. And so we have society sort of reinforcing the idea that this period of time, this adolescent period of time, is in fact a time to really focus on who are you. That means a process possibly of experimenting with who you are and what you believe, what music you like, gender identity, sexuality, all of these things. This can be a time of exploration. It can be a time that's incredibly trying for parents who see their son and or daughter diverting from the values that they have accomplished as adults, attempted to pass on to their kids, and their kids are doing the same thing they did when they were kids, questioning them, saying, is this where I want to be, or do I want to be someplace else? This can be, just like we were talking about in the storm and stress area, this can be a pretty tumultuous time, and for some families it's horrible. It's very challenging time. We should expect it. We should expect people to question those values that they've been growing up, to question the ideals of their parents. We should expect that. It should have came with the instruction manual for parenting, right? That we should understand this. We did it as well. Even if we didn't externally, we did it internally. And certainly maybe the actions of that took place later. But nonetheless, certainly we have a permissive society that allows for that right now, allows for quite a bit of experimentation and moving away from that family center. The solution to that, however, is not to jail your kids, as tempting as that might be. It is really to help them understand what they're going through and help them to teach you and be open to you what they're going through, and help them to steer clear of the actions and activities that may in fact lead them down places that are quite dangerous. And my mom, I was raised by a single mom, and I was in a small town, so I didn't go through a lot of the same sort of temptations that other kids might have gone through. But she had a practice of being the mom, and my house was where everybody went for all my brothers and myself. We were the place, and my mom felt that her best way to keep an eye on my deviance was to have the deviance occur at home. And she befriended my friends. She knew them. They knew her. She could hold us accountable. She could take all of our keys to make sure nobody's driving in any condition that they shouldn't be driving in. And as odd as that sounds, it worked. It worked. It kept me from it kept all my brothers from getting too far adrift. And so I think it was a very good strategy on her part to do that. So here we have this period of time where the focus is on identity. We're starting to paste these things together. We're starting to think long term, another hallmark of formal operational thinking. The future is abstract. So being able to actually start making these plans into the next stages that we're going to be encountering are very important. Now, I want to introduce you now to a theory that near and dear to me, the identity status theory of Canadian psychologist James Marcia. Now, when we think about identity development, and we take a predominant cognitive perspective is constructivism, meaning we put together, we create our identity through our experiences, our likes, dislikes, what we've heard from others, the people we want to emulate, and all that, and we build our sense of identity. And Marcia took this concept, looking primarily at Erikson's sort of identity development, but across the board, all the different kinds of development that we have, and began to consider that maybe there are parts of our identity that are at different statuses at different times. And I'm going to insert my language. This isn't really Marcia's language, but picture that your identity is like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, the jigsaw puzzle comes all in pieces. This is a special jigsaw puzzle. It's all aspects of who you are. It's missing pieces that you have to make yourself, and it's come with some like solid steel ones that are really hard to change. So we start building our puzzle with no benefit of the cover. We don't know where we're going most of the time. So we see the development of identity as a piecing together. Some pieces are already together. My brother's my brother forever, right? I didn't choose that, but those pieces are connected, forever. And so we have all these different pieces of our puzzle and then when we are in adolescence and beyond, we are really taking an active part in carving out. We have a jigsaw, and we're going to carve out the pieces ourselves. Okay? And Marcia described the process of creating a new piece of our identity as subject to two processes that he called crisis and commitment. And get this clear. Our identity any piece can be in one of four states, four statuses available for that. No piece of our identity can be in more than one, really. It's really just in one or the other. But we can have pieces of our identity that we're still working on. We're not going to work on them for a while, these kinds of things. And it all depends on the degree to which we've paid attention to that piece, and we've either been in crisis for that, and this means that I'm looking at the options. I'm actively planning how I want to cut that piece with the jigsaw. That's the crisis process, is the planning, looking around, considering the options. The commitment part is selecting that piece, and this is what I'm going to do. Now, the degree to which any piece of our identity has been subject to either crisis or commitment, or both crisis or commitment, or neither crisis or commitment, but yet it's a piece anyway, defines the four categories of Marcia's theory. So the graphic that I have for you uses career identity. Let's say, what are you going to be when you grow up? As an example, to exemplify identity foreclosure, identity moratorium, identity diffusion, and identity achievement for that piece. Other pieces are in different statuses. Okay, so let's take a look at that graphic here. To explain, we'll go, round the clock here. Identity foreclosure. This is an aspect of your identity. No crisis, no commitment. This was made for you. You were born into it. You are, your parents own a garage and they put the and son on the sign when you were 2. So you were pretty much foreclosed in the idea. You didn't have to put a whole lot of thought in it. So the commitment toward the prospect of a new career identity, but high commitment toward the prospect of a new career identity. I'm sorry, this is commitment. I said no, nothing. High commitment, low crisis. Okay? Here I am, this is who I am, but I never went through the process of looking at the options. So it just kind of fell in my lap. Then we have identity moratorium. This is low commitment, high crisis. And I am actively looking, but I have not made a commitment to my career ambitions. Then we have identity diffusion. I apologize for that. This is the one that has neither. It's on the back burner. I'm doing other things aside from my career right now. The average 4-year-old is certainly in identity diffusion when it comes to career. And then there's identity achievement, which Marcia says is the highest level of identity accomplishment, and that is high commitment, and that commitment arises by having explored the options. So one might imagine that, let's say you'd started dating your wife in 4th grade, and you've never dated anyone else, that truthfully, there might have been, whatever decision-making you're making in 4th grade might have been the crisis. It was, her or somebody else. But one would imagine you're in identity foreclosure. You may be perfectly happy and that's fine. None of these determine happiness. Maybe, but according to Marcia, it's not an achieved identity because you never dated anybody else. You don't know. And we will see that particular relationship ring its sometimes ugly head when we talk about midlife crisis. When we look at midlife, and we look at an individual approaching that time in their life when if they're going to make changes, they better get on it because the years are going by. It is the areas in which they feel they are foreclosed, the things that they did not feel they had a choice about, that they would then turn to and possibly make modifications there. Identity moratorium, you're actively looking and it can be like, say you've decided to come to KV, you were going to go into nursing, you are progressing right along and then said no. Okay, you looked at different colleges and you chose to come to KVCC. So right there, that is being a KVCC student is something that would be solidly in identity achievement. However, you might be looking at changing your major and you're still looking at them. That means that we've added a little crisis into your life, and sometimes it feels that way. And we say you're now in moratorium in terms of your career. So you're still achieved identity in terms of your school choice, but you might be in moratorium in terms of your major. Now, as you go into moratorium in your major, you might find out, well, I want to go into architecture, and KV doesn't have an architecture program, so suddenly your college choice is thrown into crisis along the way. More stress, more of that. And so you start looking, let's say you've decided you want to explore architecture, and now you have to go find another school. And you see how these interact with each other as we progress through the way of us making our identity out of all of these pieces. Okay, so let's go through some of the terms here. We have applications of this to any aspect of your identity, from what kind of car you're going to get, to your spouse and relationships, to friends, to college choices, to careers, to having kids, everything having to do with creating a sense of who you are. It is the construction of your identity. There are multiple statuses going on at any given time. You can have multiple parts of you that are in any one of these, but each part is uniquely in one place at a given time. Remember, this is a status. Remember when we talked in Intro to Psych, we talk about states and traits. States or statuses are fluid. They change over time. So you might be in achievement now. Your relationship might be great. You dated, you found Mr. Right. Mr. Right turns out to be Mr. Wrong, and suddenly you're in crisis, and maybe you go for a while, you're not even going to look, I don't want to be in a relationship at all. You head over to identity diffusion, back burner stuff, and then slowly you start thinking, well, maybe I'll get back into the game and start dating a little bit. Now your identity, your relationship identity, moves into identity moratorium until you find Mr. Right again. And then you go into identity achievement. You can see we're fluid. We move through these. So we have multiple statuses going on at the same time. And the notion of puzzle pieces, which I introduce in this chapter. There's a little bit about my theory of puzzle pieces, which is trying to explain some anomalous behaviors I came across. But the notion of identity development being characterized as a jigsaw puzzle, and that we are in possession of a jigsaw, that some of those pieces have been carved for us, and those are very difficult to change. And some of them we are fully in charge of. And sometimes the progress of maturation is really determining what pieces can you change, what pieces do you need to accept, what pieces do you need to build around them so that they're enclosed and protected. These guys, you can take the analogy whenever you want, but the analogy of a puzzle piece's orientation to our identity is part of the work that I'm doing right now in preparing a manuscript for publication. Alrighty, so that brings us to our assessments at the end of this chapter. Now, this chapter covers 2 weeks. So in the first week, I'm asking you to, in Chapter 6 Discussion A, I'm asking you to consider that notion of the connection between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex as it pertains to juvenile justice and criminal culpability, meaning a person cannot be charged for a crime unless you can prove that they intended to do it and understood the possible consequences. And there's question to whether or not a person's limbic system, when it's not connected to the prefrontal cortex, has that capacity or not. So that is currently kind of a hot topic in juvenile justice. So that's a discussion. Then we're going to have another discussion on adolescent egocentrism, yourself, people around you. Do you have any knowledge of people like this in your environment? We'll take a look at that. And then the quiz is on perspective taking. Now, next week, there's an assignment due, and that assignment is an identity status assignment where you're going to go and explain some aspects of your identity in line with Marcia's theory. Basically, filling those cells with 4 different aspects of your identity that currently occupy each one of those. Now that's one in each one, a different sense of identity in each one. That's critical. The other way you can approach this is actually linear. You can actually start at the beginning, diffusion, and then move through. You might move. Let's say you were in that, you were born, your parents were mechanics and you were a son or daughter. Painted on the sign when you were 2. So certainly when you were young, it was, diffusion. But then pretty early on, you looked at the sign, pretty much felt that's where you were going to go. So you became a mechanic. And for a while, you thought that was what you wanted to do. Then you got exposed to a great field like psychology. And you said, okay, I think I might want to do that. And now you're into moratorium. You're starting to consider the options. So you've gone straight from diffusion to foreclosure, and now you're into moratorium looking at the options. You come to school, you become a psychologist, and you now have an achieved identity. You can actually look at it linear. Maybe some backtracking too, if you lose your job or, something like that. You can actually follow it linear. But for this assignment, the easiest way to go is to pick 4 different aspects of your life, one of each fits in one of those areas. Some aspect of your life that's diffused, some aspect of your life that's foreclosed, in moratorium, and achieved. So that's next week. That's not due this week. You can certainly do it this week. Take next week off from this class, but the 2 discussions and the quiz are due this week. And then next week, I won't be doing another video, just announcing that the Chapter 6 assignment will be due. So have a great week, and I hope to see you in the discussion boards.